Ma'am, open the door right now. The officer's voice cut through the quiet street like a siren that hadn't started yet. The porch light above the small brick house flickered softly in the cool evening air, casting a warm yellow circle over the wooden steps and the narrow patch of grass beside the walkway. Evelyn Carter had lived in that house for 43 years, long enough to see 3 generations of children ride bicycles down Maplewood Drive, long enough to watch the oak tree across the street grow from a thin sapling into a towering canopy that shaded half the block every summer. At 72, her nights were simple. A kettle warming on the stove, the faint scent of chamomile tea drifting through the kitchen, the quiet ticking of the old wall clock that had belonged to her late husband. She had just lifted her teacup when the knock came again, louder this time, followed by the sharp glow of red and blue lights washing across her living room curtains. Evelyn paused beside the small kitchen table, her hand steady on the ceramic mug. Through the thin glass of the front window, she could see the silhouette of a tall man standing on her porch, the reflective stripes of a police uniform catching the light from the patrol car idling at the curb. Another cruiser sat behind it, engine humming softly. Maplewood Drive wasn't the kind of street where police cars lingered. Most evenings the loudest sound came from Mr. Henderson's wind chimes or the distant laughter of kids finishing a basketball game in the cul-de-sac. Evelyn set the mug down carefully and walked toward the front door, her house slippers whispering against the hardwood floor. The officer knocked again, harder now, his fist landing against the wood in sharp, impatient beats. "Ma'am, I know you're inside," he called out. His name tag read Officer Daniel Brooks, though Evelyn could only make out the glint of the metal from behind the glass panel. The porch light reflected off his badge and the dark visor of the patrol car behind him. Across the street, a curtain shifted. Someone was watching. Another porch light clicked on farther down the block. The neighborhood had begun to notice. Evelyn reached the door, but didn't open it yet. She looked through the narrow glass pane first, just as her husband had always told her to do years ago. Officer Brooks stood with his hands on his duty belt, shoulders squared, his expression already tight with irritation. He glanced briefly toward the patrol car, then back at the door. "Ma'am," he said again, slower now. "We need to talk." Evelyn's voice, when she finally spoke through the door, was calm and steady, the voice of someone who had spent 35 years reading books aloud to restless children in a school library. "Good evening, officer. Is there something wrong?" Brooks exhaled sharply, as if the simple question annoyed him. "We've received a report that someone connected to an ongoing investigation may have been seen entering this residence." He looked down at a small notepad in his hand, then back up. "So I'm going to need you to open the door." The kettle in the kitchen began to click faintly as it cooled on the stove. Evelyn glanced over her shoulder for a moment, then returned her attention to the officer outside. The street was quiet now except for the low rumble of the cruiser's engine and the distant chirp of crickets drifting in from the tree line behind the houses. A second officer remained near the patrol car, speaking quietly into a radio. "Officer," Evelyn replied gently, "I live here alone." Brooks shifted his weight and stepped a little closer to the door. "Then this will be quick," he said. "Open the door so we can take a look inside." The words hung there between them. Evelyn's eyes moved once more toward the street. Across the road, Mrs. Delgado stood on her porch in a robe, her phone held loosely at her side. 2 houses down, someone else had stepped onto their driveway. The neighborhood was watching now. Evelyn rested her hand against the doorframe, her voice still soft but unmistakably firm. "Officer Brooks," she said, "do you have a warrant?" For a brief moment, the night seemed to hold its breath. Brooks didn't answer immediately. Instead, a faint smile crossed his face, the kind that carried more impatience than reassurance. He leaned slightly toward the door, the porch light catching the edge of his badge again. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you really don't want to make this more complicated than it needs to be." Inside the house, the old clock on the wall ticked once, twice, 3 times. Evelyn Carter stood calmly behind the door of the home she had lived in for nearly half a century, unaware that the quiet moment unfolding on her front porch was about to change the course of Officer Daniel Brooks's career in ways he had never imagined. The porch light hummed softly above the doorway as the night air settled over Maplewood Drive, carrying the distant smell of freshly cut grass from somewhere down the block. Evelyn Carter remained still behind the door, her hand resting lightly against the brass handle, the cool metal pressing gently into her palm. Officer Daniel Brooks shifted his stance on the porch, his boots creaking faintly against the wooden boards as he glanced toward the patrol car idling at the curb. The rotating lights had stopped, but their fading glow still reflected across the windows of the quiet street. Brooks looked back at the door with the same impatient expression, his jaw tight, his fingers tapping once against the small notebook in his hand. "Ma'am," he said again, his tone firm but controlled. "This is part of an active investigation." Evelyn did not raise her voice. She had spent most of her life speaking gently to children who believed the world moved too fast, and that calm rhythm had never left her. "Officer Brooks," she replied through the glass panel, "I respect the work you do, but you still have not answered my question." Across the street, Mrs. Delgado lifted her phone slightly, the screen glowing faintly as she watched from her porch. Two teenage boys who had been walking past the corner slowed their steps near the mailbox, pretending to check something on one of their bicycles while their eyes stayed fixed on the scene. Brooks noticed the attention now. He straightened his shoulders and took one slow breath through his nose. "Ma'am," he said, forcing patience into the words, "we received a credible report that a person connected to a case might have entered this residence less than an hour ago." Inside the house, the quiet kitchen clock continued its steady ticking. Evelyn glanced toward the hallway where framed photographs lined the wall. There was one picture of her husband in his Navy uniform from decades ago, another of her standing beside a group of smiling elementary school students holding library books above their heads, and one photograph near the end of the hallway that showed a young man in a dark suit standing in front of a courthouse, his expression serious but proud. Evelyn turned back to the door. "Officer," she said gently, "no one has entered this house tonight." Brooks let out a short breath that sounded more like frustration than disbelief. "That may be your opinion," he replied, "but we still need to confirm it." The second officer near the patrol car spoke quietly into his shoulder radio, his voice low and distant under the steady hum of the engine. Brooks took a small step closer to the door, lowering his voice slightly, as if he expected cooperation to arrive simply through persistence. "Ma'am, if you open the door and let us look around, this will be finished in 5 minutes." Evelyn's expression did not change, though the porch light revealed the faint lines around her eyes that only decades of patience could draw. "Officer Brooks," she said once more, "this home has always been open to neighbors, students, and anyone who needed help. But the law still matters." Brooks stared through the narrow pane of glass, clearly weighing how far he wanted to push the moment. The quiet of the neighborhood had thickened now, the way it sometimes does just before a storm, even though the sky above Maplewood Drive was perfectly clear. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. "You are refusing to cooperate with a police investigation," Brooks said carefully. Evelyn shook her head slowly, the movement barely visible through the glass. "No, officer," she replied. "I am simply asking you to follow the same rules everyone else must follow." Brooks looked past her briefly, trying to peer into the dim hallway behind her, but the warm kitchen light only revealed the edge of the small dining table and the quiet comfort of a house that had stood peacefully on that street for decades. The officer's patience was beginning to thin, and the neighbors could feel it even from across the road. Evelyn Carter remained exactly where she stood, calm and steady behind the door of the home she had built her life in, unaware that the quiet conversation unfolding on her porch was already beginning to ripple far beyond Maplewood Drive. Officer Daniel Brooks stood on the porch for several seconds without speaking, the silence stretching long enough for the quiet sounds of Maplewood Drive to return one by one. The low hum of the patrol car engine drifted through the cool air. Somewhere down the block a screen door closed softly. Brooks shifted his weight again, his boots pressing against the old wooden boards of the porch that had carried decades of footsteps from neighbors, mail carriers, and children selling cookies for school fundraisers. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the calm figure behind the door. Evelyn Carter did not move. The warm kitchen light behind her framed the small hallway of the home she had lived in longer than many of the houses on the street had even existed. Brooks had seen hundreds of homes during his years in uniform. Some smelled of fear the moment the door opened. Others carried the quiet signs of people who had something to hide. This house did not feel like either. The windows were clean. The porch railing had been freshly painted sometime during the summer. A small ceramic bird feeder hung near the corner of the roof, where sparrows often gathered in the morning. Everything about the place looked orderly, peaceful, almost stubbornly normal. Brooks glanced down at his notebook again, even though he already knew what it said. The report had come through dispatch less than 40 minutes earlier. An anonymous caller claimed someone connected to an ongoing investigation had been seen entering a residence on Maplewood Drive shortly before sunset. The description had been vague. A dark sedan. A tall man. Possibly wearing a suit. It was not the kind of tip that usually pulled 2 patrol cars across town. But the case connected to that report had already stirred attention inside the department. Brooks looked back toward the patrol car, where Officer Grant Keller leaned against the driver's side door, speaking quietly into his radio. Keller was younger, barely 5 years on the force, and he watched the situation with the cautious patience of someone who still believed procedures existed for a reason. Brooks turned back to the door and spoke again, this time slower, each word deliberate. "Ma'am, we are not here to cause trouble. We are simply following information that was passed to us." Evelyn's voice remained gentle, but it carried the steady clarity of someone who had repeated the same principle many times before. "Information does not replace the law, Officer Brooks." The words hung in the cool air between them. Brooks exhaled through his nose and briefly looked past his shoulder again. More porch lights had turned on along the block. Maplewood Drive had that way of quietly waking up when something unusual happened. A man across the street now stood beside Mrs. Delgado, arms folded as he watched the scene. Brooks knew what the neighbors saw. A police officer standing at the door of a 72-year-old woman who had lived there longer than most of them had even owned their homes. He could feel their eyes measuring every movement. "You understand," Brooks said carefully, "that refusing to cooperate can raise concerns." Evelyn tilted her head slightly as she looked at him through the narrow glass panel. "Officer Brooks," she said calmly, "I have spent my entire life teaching children the importance of rules. I am simply asking you to respect them." The officer's jaw tightened just enough for the porch light to catch the small movement. He stepped closer to the door, trying once more to look past her into the hallway. His eyes briefly noticed the row of framed photographs along the wall. One showed a younger Evelyn standing beside a group of elementary school students. Another captured an older couple sitting on the very same porch decades earlier, smiling into the sun. Then Brooks noticed the final photograph near the end of the hallway. A man in a dark blue suit standing in front of a tall stone courthouse. The brass plaque behind him was too far away to read clearly, but the shape of the building was unmistakable to anyone who had worked long enough in the city. Brooks frowned slightly as he leaned forward a fraction of an inch. "Who else lives here?" he asked. Evelyn answered without hesitation. "No one, officer." Brooks nodded slowly, though his eyes lingered on that photograph a moment longer than before. The quiet street, the watching neighbors, and the calm woman behind the door had begun to form a situation he could no longer control with simple authority. And yet Officer Daniel Brooks still believed he was standing on the stronger side of the law. Officer Daniel Brooks kept his eyes on the photograph for a moment longer, the porch light reflecting faintly against the glass of the frame deep inside the hallway. The man in the picture stood straight, wearing a dark blue suit and a narrow silver tie, his posture confident, the stone columns of a courthouse rising behind him. Brooks could not read the plaque from where he stood, but something about the image tugged at his memory. He straightened again and cleared his throat, forcing his attention back to the elderly woman behind the door. The neighborhood had grown even quieter now, the way streets often do when people sense that a small moment might turn into something larger. Mrs. Delgado across the road lifted her phone a little higher, its screen glowing pale against the darkness. 2 houses down, a porch swing creaked slowly as someone shifted their weight while watching. Brooks placed one hand against his belt and leaned slightly toward the glass panel again. "Ma'am," he said with a controlled patience that had begun to sound thinner than before, "you mentioned that you live here alone." Evelyn Carter nodded once. Her expression had not changed since the conversation began. The same calm composure she carried when guiding children through quiet reading hours in the old elementary school library years ago. "Yes, officer." Brooks tilted his head toward the hallway behind her. "Then who is the man in the photograph?" Evelyn glanced briefly over her shoulder, following his line of sight toward the frame on the wall. For a moment, the warm light from the kitchen illuminated the photograph more clearly. The courthouse columns, the polished shoes, the small American flag pin on the lapel of the suit jacket. She turned back toward the door and answered in the same even tone she had used all evening. "That is my son." Brooks nodded slowly, as if the answer carried no particular importance. "Does your son live here with you?" "No," Evelyn replied. "He lives in the city." Brooks folded his arms loosely across his chest, the reflective strip on his sleeve catching the porch light. "And what does he do in the city?" The question hung there longer than the others had. Evelyn did not rush her response. She simply rested her hand against the doorframe again, the polished wood cool beneath her fingers. "He works in law." Brooks gave a short nod, though his attention remained partly on the photograph inside the hallway. Something about the setting of that picture still felt familiar, but the detail refused to settle clearly in his mind. The courthouse looked like many others. Across the state, tall stone columns, wide steps, flags moving gently above the roofline. Brooks had stood in front of buildings like that dozens of times while transporting suspects or filing reports. "Law is a broad field," he said. "Attorney?" Evelyn's voice remained calm. "Yes." Brooks shifted his weight again, glancing briefly toward Officer Keller near the patrol car. Keller had finished speaking on the radio and now stood quietly beside the cruiser, watching the exchange with cautious attention. Brooks returned his focus to the door. "Corporate law? Private practice?" Evelyn gave the smallest hint of a smile, not proud or defensive, simply patient. "Public service." Brooks exhaled quietly and glanced toward the photograph once more. The courthouse in the background seemed clearer now under the warm interior light. A bronze plaque beside the entrance. A flag above the steps. Brooks squinted slightly, as if trying to recall something from memory. Behind him the street remained silent except for the faint chirp of insects in the trees and the low rumble of the cruiser's engine. The neighbors continued watching, their quiet presence forming an invisible circle around the scene. Brooks turned back toward the door and spoke again, his voice carrying a little less certainty than before. "Public service where?" Evelyn answered simply. "At the federal courthouse downtown." Brooks felt a faint shift in his expression before he could stop it. The building in the photograph suddenly looked much more familiar. He had been there before. Many times. The tall steps, the stone columns, the bronze seal above the entrance. Brooks studied the photograph again through the glass panel, noticing details he had overlooked earlier. The careful posture, the small American flag pin, the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where that picture had been taken. For the first time since arriving on Maplewood Drive, Officer Daniel Brooks began to wonder whether the quiet house in front of him might hold more significance than the anonymous report that had brought him there. Officer Daniel Brooks remained on the porch for several seconds without speaking, his attention still drawn toward the photograph deep inside the hallway. The warm interior light continued to illuminate the image just enough for the courthouse columns to appear unmistakably federal. Brooks had been inside that building more than once over the past few years. He remembered the long marble corridors, the quiet elevators, the sharp echo of footsteps across polished floors. Something about the man in the photograph stirred a faint sense of recognition, but the thought refused to settle completely. Brooks straightened his posture again and cleared his throat, returning his focus to the door where Evelyn Carter stood calmly behind the glass. The neighbors across Maplewood Drive had not moved. Mrs. Delgado's phone was still raised, its small lens pointed steadily toward the porch. 2 more lights had turned on down the street. The quiet suburban block, now fully aware that something unusual was unfolding outside the Carter home. Brooks adjusted the position of his duty belt and spoke again, his voice firm but noticeably more measured than before. "Ma'am, you said your son works at the federal courthouse downtown." Evelyn nodded gently. "Yes, officer." Brooks glanced once more at the photograph. The man in the frame looked confident, composed, the kind of posture that came from years of standing inside courtrooms rather than outside them. Brooks tried to keep his tone neutral. "What kind of work does he do there?" Evelyn did not hesitate. "He works for the United States government." Brooks shifted his weight slightly. The porch boards creaked beneath his boots. Behind him the cruiser's engine continued its quiet rumble, and Officer Keller remained near the driver's side door watching the exchange with increasing curiosity. Brooks kept his eyes on Evelyn. "There are many positions in that building," he said carefully. Clerks, investigators, administrative staff. Evelyn's calm expression never wavered. My son is an attorney. The words seemed to settle into the night air with unexpected weight. Brooks gave a small nod, though the movement carried less confidence than before. A federal attorney? Evelyn answered simply. Yes. Brooks briefly looked toward the photograph again. The small American flag pin on the suit lapel now caught his attention more clearly through the glass. The courthouse behind the man was unmistakably the federal building downtown on Jefferson Avenue. Brooks knew the place well enough to picture the bronze seal mounted above the entrance doors. He folded his arms loosely and spoke again, though the certainty in his voice had begun to thin. And your son happens to be visiting tonight? Evelyn shook her head slowly. No, officer. My son is working late in the city. Brooks frowned slightly, trying to reconcile the information with the anonymous report that had sent 2 patrol cars. Across town, the caller had described a tall man arriving in a dark sedan shortly before sunset. Brooks glanced toward the quiet street again, as if expecting to see that vehicle parked somewhere nearby. But Maplewood Drive remained unchanged. Neatly trimmed lawns, quiet porches, the oak trees swaying gently above the sidewalk. Then I will ask again, Brooks said carefully. Has anyone entered this residence tonight? Evelyn's answer remained the same. No, officer. Brooks took a slow breath, feeling the eyes of the neighborhood still fixed on his back. The photograph inside the hallway continued to bother him in a way he could not fully explain. Something about the man's face looked familiar now. Brooks leaned slightly toward the glass again, trying to see the details more clearly. What is your son's name? He asked. Evelyn answered without hesitation. Marcus Carter. The name landed with quiet clarity in the still night air. Brooks felt a faint tightening in his chest as the recognition finally surfaced. He had heard that name many times before, usually in briefing rooms and courthouse hallways where federal cases were discussed in careful tones. Brooks straightened slowly on the porch, his eyes drifting once more toward the photograph in the hallway. For the first time since arriving on Maplewood Drive, the confident certainty that had carried him to Evelyn Carter's door began to slip slightly beneath the calm weight of a simple realization. Officer Daniel Brooks did not speak right away after hearing the name. The quiet street seemed to grow even stiller, as if Maplewood Drive itself had paused to listen. Marcus Carter. The name echoed in Brooks's mind with a clarity that made his earlier confidence feel suddenly misplaced. He had heard that name during department briefings, in conversations between supervisors, and more than once in the corridors of the federal courthouse downtown. Marcus Carter was not just another attorney. He was one of the United States attorneys assigned to several high-profile federal prosecutions in the region. Brooks slowly lifted his chin and looked again through the narrow glass panel in the door. The photograph inside the hallway now appeared sharper in his mind than it had moments earlier. The courthouse steps, the American flag pin on the suit jacket, the calm, deliberate posture of a man accustomed to standing in courtrooms where every word carried weight. Brooks felt the faintest tightening along the back of his neck. Behind him, Officer Grant Keller had stepped a little closer from the patrol car, drawn by the subtle shift in tone. Keller spoke quietly from the edge of the walkway. Everything all right, Daniel? Brooks did not immediately answer. His eyes remained on Evelyn Carter, who still stood calmly behind the door, as though the entire exchange were nothing more than a routine conversation. Her composure had not changed once since the first knock. The porch light above them buzzed faintly, casting a warm circle across the wooden boards. Brooks cleared his throat. Ma'am, he said carefully. Your son's name is Marcus Carter? Evelyn nodded once. Yes. Brooks looked briefly toward Keller and then back to the door. He felt the awareness of the neighbors pressing quietly against the moment. Mrs. Delgado still stood across the street with her phone raised, her face half illuminated by the screen. Another neighbor had stepped onto his driveway now, arms folded, observing in silence. Brooks turned back to Evelyn. Marcus Carter, who works at the federal courthouse on Jefferson Avenue? Evelyn's voice remained steady. Yes, officer. Brooks shifted his weight again, suddenly aware that the situation on this porch had grown more complicated than the anonymous tip that had brought him here. The report had described a tall man arriving in a dark sedan shortly before sunset. But nothing about the quiet home on Maplewood Drive suggested a place where someone would attempt to hide from a federal investigation. Brooks spoke again, slower now. Your son is one of the United States attorneys assigned to the district office, correct? Evelyn gave a small nod. Yes. The answer settled over the porch with unmistakable finality. Brooks exhaled slowly, glancing once more toward the photograph inside the hallway. The recognition had fully formed now. He had seen Marcus Carter standing at the front of a courtroom only 2 months earlier while transporting a suspect for testimony. The same confident posture, the same calm expression. Brooks straightened his shoulders again, though the certainty he had carried when arriving on Maplewood Drive no longer felt quite as solid. Ma'am, he said, choosing his words with greater care. The reason we are here tonight is because of a report connected to an active federal investigation. Evelyn listened without interrupting. But you understand, Brooks continued, that we still have a responsibility to confirm whether anyone entered this residence earlier this evening. Evelyn rested her hand lightly against the doorframe again, her voice as calm as the quiet street around them. Officer Brooks, I understand responsibilities very well. Brooks met her gaze through the glass. The calm dignity in her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent a lifetime believing in rules rather than bending them. The porch light hummed softly above them while the cruiser idled at the curb and the neighbors watched from their driveways. Brooks had come to Maplewood Drive expecting a routine stop, another quick check tied to a vague report. Instead, he now stood on the porch of the mother of a federal prosecutor whose name carried influence in the same courthouse where Brooks had walked countless times before. And for the first time since knocking on Evelyn Carter's door, Officer Daniel Brooks began to sense that the direction of the night might not be under his control after all. Officer Daniel Brooks felt the quiet weight of the moment settle across the porch like a change in the air before rain. The name Marcus Carter had already shifted the balance of the conversation, but the deeper realization was only beginning to reach him. Brooks had walked through the federal courthouse on Jefferson Avenue enough times to understand exactly how closely the worlds of local policing and federal prosecution could intersect. A United States attorney did not just represent the government in courtrooms. That position carried influence that reached into investigations, oversight, and the careful scrutiny of police conduct when cases crossed into federal jurisdiction. Brooks kept his posture straight, though the confidence that had carried him up the steps of Evelyn Carter's porch now moved more cautiously beneath his uniform. The porch light continued to buzz softly above them, and the quiet suburban street remained still except for the low rumble of the patrol car engine at the curb. Officer Grant Keller had stepped closer now, standing near the edge of the walkway with his hands resting lightly on his duty belt, watching Brooks with the silent curiosity of someone sensing that the situation had become more delicate than either of them expected. Brooks cleared his throat and spoke again, his voice noticeably more controlled. Ma'am, we appreciate your cooperation tonight. Evelyn Carter stood calmly behind the door as she had from the beginning, the warm light from her kitchen illuminating the hallway behind her. I am always willing to cooperate with the law, officer, she replied. Brooks nodded once, though the gesture carried more thoughtfulness than authority now. His eyes drifted briefly toward the photograph inside the hallway again. The face in the frame was unmistakable now that the name had settled in his mind. Marcus Carter had argued federal cases involving fraud, interstate trafficking, and civil rights violations. Brooks had once heard his supervisor mention Carter during a departmental briefing about proper procedure during joint investigations. Brooks shifted his weight slightly and spoke more carefully than before. Ma'am, when was the last time you spoke with your son? Evelyn answered with the same steady calm. Earlier this evening. Brooks felt Keller's attention sharpen beside him. Earlier tonight? Brooks asked. Evelyn nodded. Yes, around dinner time. Brooks glanced toward the quiet street again. The neighbors remained in place, silent witnesses to a conversation that had slowly changed shape without anyone raising their voice. Mrs. Delgado's phone was still raised across the road, the small camera lens reflecting the porch light. Brooks turned back to the door. Did he mention anything about visiting tonight? Evelyn shook her head gently. No, officer. Brooks let the answer settle. The anonymous report that had brought them here now felt less certain in his mind. A vague description of a tall man arriving in a dark sedan was not unusual in a neighborhood like Maplewood Drive. Half the professionals in the city drove vehicles that matched that description. Brooks straightened again and spoke with a tone that carried the first hint of restraint since the evening began. Ma'am, If you do happen to hear from your son tonight, you may want to let him know that officers stopped by regarding a report connected to an investigation. Evelyn's eyes remained steady on him through the glass. I will let him know you visited. The words were simple, but Brooks could hear the quiet implication beneath them. The porch boards creaked softly as he shifted back one step. Officer Keller glanced toward him as if waiting for a decision. Brooks took one more look through the narrow glass panel at the hallway inside the house. The framed photographs, the quiet dining table, the steady dignity of a woman who had not raised her voice once during the entire exchange. Brooks had arrived believing he held complete authority over the situation. But the realization that he had just confronted the mother of a federal prosecutor had introduced a level of scrutiny that no patrol officer ignored lightly. Brooks exhaled slowly and nodded once toward Evelyn Carter. Thank you for your time this evening, ma'am. The porch light flickered faintly above them while Maplewood Drive remained silent, and Officer Daniel Brooks began to understand that the quiet conversation at this front door might soon travel far beyond the peaceful street where it had begun. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped back from the door with a small nod, the kind that signaled the end of a conversation that had not gone the way he originally expected. The porch boards creaked softly beneath his boots as he moved down one step, and the quiet of Maplewood Drive seemed to slowly loosen its grip on the moment. Across the street, Mrs. Delgado lowered her phone slightly, but did not walk away. The neighbors who had gathered on their porches remained still, their attention lingering on the patrol cars and the calm woman standing inside the doorway of her home. Evelyn Carter had not moved since Brooks first knocked on her door. The warm light from her kitchen continued to frame the hallway behind her, the line of family photographs resting peacefully against the wall as if they had witnessed hundreds of evenings just like this one. Brooks paused halfway down the steps and turned back once more, as though he wanted to make sure the conversation had ended properly. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice measured. "Thank you for your patience tonight." Evelyn gave a polite nod through the glass. "Good evening, officer." The simplicity of the response carried the quiet dignity she had shown throughout the entire exchange. Brooks turned away and walked toward the patrol car, where Officer Grant Keller waited beside the driver's side door. Keller spoke quietly as Brooks approached. "That went differently than I expected." Brooks rested one hand on the roof of the cruiser and looked back toward the house for a moment. The porch light still glowed warmly above the doorway where Evelyn Carter stood calmly watching the officers leave. Brooks lowered his voice so the neighbors could not hear. "That is the mother of a United States attorney." Keller's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Marcus Carter?" Brooks nodded once. Keller exhaled slowly and glanced toward the house again, his expression shifting as the realization settled in. "That explains the calm," he said quietly. Brooks did not answer right away. His eyes moved across the quiet street where the neighbors had begun slowly returning to their homes. Porch lights flicked off one by one as the tension that had briefly gathered on Maplewood Drive began to fade. Brooks opened the patrol car door, but paused before getting inside. Something about the entire situation still lingered in his thoughts. The anonymous report that had triggered the visit now felt thinner than before, like a rumor that had grown louder than its facts deserved. Brooks looked toward Keller again. "We will note that the residence was checked and no contact was made with the individual described in the report." Keller nodded. "Understood." Brooks finally slid into the driver's seat and rested his hands lightly on the steering wheel. The dashboard lights cast a soft glow across the interior of the cruiser while the engine continued its low rumble. Keller moved around to the passenger side and climbed in. For a moment, neither officer spoke. Through the windshield, they could still see Evelyn Carter standing quietly inside her doorway, the warm light of her home steady behind her. Brooks turned the ignition slightly, and the patrol car shifted into motion, rolling slowly away from the curb. As they drove down Maplewood Drive, the quiet neighborhood returned to its usual calm. Porch lights dimmed. Curtains closed. The oak tree near the corner swayed gently in the evening breeze. Brooks kept his eyes on the road ahead, but the events of the evening continued to settle in his mind. A simple knock on a quiet front door had unexpectedly intersected with a name that carried weight inside the federal courthouse downtown. He knew that conversations involving federal prosecutors often traveled farther than anyone expected. As the patrol car turned onto the next street, the calm house on Maplewood Drive disappeared behind them. But Officer Daniel Brooks could not shake the sense that the quiet conversation on that porch had only begun a story that was far from finished. The patrol car disappeared around the corner of Maplewood Drive, its headlights fading slowly into the quiet grid of suburban streets. Inside the small brick house, Evelyn Carter remained by the door for a few moments longer, listening to the distant hum of the cruiser's engine as it grew fainter and finally vanished into the night. The porch light continued to glow softly above the doorway, casting a warm circle across the front steps that had carried decades of familiar footsteps. Across the street, Mrs. Delgado lowered her phone completely now and offered a small wave through the window before returning inside her house. One by one, the lights along Maplewood Drive dimmed again as neighbors closed their curtains and resumed the calm routines of an ordinary evening. Evelyn gently turned the lock on the front door and stepped back into the quiet comfort of her home. The hallway remained exactly as it had been earlier that evening. The framed photographs rested against the wall, silent witnesses to a life built slowly through years of patience and steady work. Evelyn walked past them and returned to the small kitchen where the kettle still sat on the stove. The chamomile tea she had poured earlier had cooled slightly, but she lifted the mug anyway and carried it to the dining table beside the window. Outside, the oak tree near the curb swayed softly in the evening breeze while the street returned to the peaceful rhythm it had known for decades. Evelyn took a slow sip of tea and allowed herself a quiet breath. The conversation on her porch had lasted less than 15 minutes, yet it had stirred the entire neighborhood for a brief moment. She placed the mug down and reached for her phone on the table. The screen glowed softly as she scrolled through her contacts until she found the familiar name. Marcus Carter. For a moment she simply looked at it, her expression thoughtful rather than worried. She pressed the call button. Several miles away in a tall office building near the federal courthouse on Jefferson Avenue, Marcus Carter stood beside a wide window overlooking the city lights. His office desk was covered with neatly arranged case files, the kind that carried months of careful investigation behind them. The phone on his desk vibrated softly, and he glanced down at the screen. When he saw his mother's name, he answered immediately. "Good evening, Mom." Evelyn smiled slightly as she leaned back in her chair. "Good evening, Marcus." The calm warmth in her voice carried across the line. "Did I interrupt your work?" Marcus looked toward the courthouse building visible through the window across the street. "No, I was just reviewing some documents." He paused. "Is everything all right?" Evelyn rested her hand lightly on the table. "Two officers stopped by the house earlier this evening." Marcus straightened slightly at the window. "Officers?" Evelyn nodded, even though he could not see her. They were following a report about someone possibly entering the neighborhood. Marcus listened quietly. "Did they say why they came to your door?" Evelyn's voice remained gentle. "They asked a few questions." Marcus's tone shifted with quiet concern. "Were they respectful?" Evelyn took another sip of tea before answering. "Eventually." The word lingered in the silence between them. Marcus exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting toward the courthouse across the street where several office lights still burned late into the night. "Did they give you their names?" Evelyn replied calmly. "Officer Daniel Brooks." Marcus repeated the name softly, committing it to memory. He had spent years inside courtrooms where every detail mattered, every conversation carried consequences, and every action was weighed carefully against the law he had sworn to uphold. Evelyn sensed the shift in his silence and spoke again before he could respond further. "Marcus, the situation is already over." Marcus nodded slightly, even though she could not see him. "I understand." Evelyn's voice carried the quiet wisdom that had guided him since childhood. Sometimes a simple conversation teaches people more than an argument ever could. Marcus looked out across the city lights again, thoughtful now. "Did the officers leave peacefully?" Evelyn smiled gently. "Yes, they did." The calm certainty in her answer allowed the moment to settle. Outside her window, the quiet street of Maplewood Drive remained unchanged, the porch light still glowing softly above the steps where the evening's conversation had taken place. Evelyn Carter lifted her tea once more and gazed toward the peaceful neighborhood